The grizzly bear rose to its full height, 9 feet of muscle, bone and fury, less than 30 yards from the small log cabin. Inside, Samuel Bridger stood perfectly still behind a narrow gun port, his rifle already leveled, the hammer resting in the half-cocked position. But he didn't fire. Not yet. The bear circled the structure with deliberate intelligence, sniffing, pressing its weight against the rough-hewn logs, searching for the weakest point. It raked its claws across the door, testing the frame. Nothing moved. It tried the corners next, places where most frontier cabins could be pried apart like loose crates. Still nothing. 20 long minutes passed. Finally, the great grizzly surrendered its investigation and slipped back into the wide Montana wilderness. Samuel slowly lowered his rifle. He had survived. Again. But the story of how this simple cabin held firm against one of the most powerful beasts in North America began months earlier, and it began in tragedy. The year was 1837. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was nearing the end of its golden age. Beaver pelts still fetched high prices in eastern markets, and men willing to gamble their lives on the frontier could earn a year's wages in a single season. Yet the risks were immense. Brutal winters, territorial disputes, accidents, starvation, and above all, the ever-present danger of grizzly bears. Most mountain men accepted these hazards as part of the life they had chosen. But Samuel Bridger was different. Cautious by nature, blessed with skill and no small amount of luck, he had survived 7 winters along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River. For him, caution was a discipline, not a burden. But in the spring of 1837, his luck failed him, through no fault of his own. That season, Samuel partnered with a German immigrant named John Hoffman, a capable trapper who had arrived in the Rockies only a few years earlier. Together, they established a small camp near the confluence of 2 quiet streams in what is now southwestern Montana. It was the perfect location, rich in beaver sign, sheltered by forest and far from any major travel routes. Their cabin, like most built by trappers, was simple. Logs notched at the corners. Moss and mud packed into the gaps. A dirt floor, 1 small window, a single door made from a roughly split pine plank. It had taken them 4 days to build. It kept out the wind and it was dry. That was all a cabin needed, or so they believed. On April 14, 1837, John set out alone to check the trap lines, while Samuel stayed behind to flesh and stack the pelts from the previous day. Shortly after midday, 3 shots rang out, rapid, desperate, from the direction of the beaver ponds. Then silence. Samuel seized his rifle and ran. He found his partner a mile from camp. A grizzly had struck with its usual terrifying suddenness. John had fired, but the shot had only wounded the animal. The enraged bear killed him with staggering speed and vanished back into the brush just moments before Samuel arrived. Samuel buried his friend on a quiet hillside overlooking the creek. He piled stones over the mound to keep scavengers away and returned to the cabin alone. That night he couldn't sleep. It wasn't just grief. It was the realization that the small structure he now relied on for shelter offered almost no real protection. A determined bear could break through the thin door with little effort. The gaps in the walls could be widened in minutes. The window was a fatal flaw. For the first time, Samuel truly felt the vulnerability that every mountain man lived with, but rarely acknowledged. Over the next several weeks, as he continued trapping to finish the season, Samuel became obsessed with cabin construction. He visited other trappers' camps. He studied their cabins not for comfort but for failure points. He found doors ripped from their hinges. He saw corner notches torn apart by bears using sheer leverage. He pressed his fingers into chinking so loose that even he could widen it. He listened to men who had survived cabin attacks, studying their accounts like a scholar examining battlefield reports. A pattern emerged. Bears tested structures systematically. First the door, then the corner joints, then any gaps in the walls. And when they found a weakness, they exploited it with frightening strength. Samuel finished the spring season and headed east to St. Louis to sell his pelts. The journey took 3 weeks by horseback, 3 weeks of thinking, analyzing, and turning over ideas in his mind. He had no formal education, no training in engineering. But he did have something many mountain men lacked: the determination to solve a problem no one else would bother with. In St. Louis, while other trappers spent their hard-earned profits in taverns, Samuel spent 2 full weeks studying buildings. He examined brick structures and noticed how interlocking patterns distributed force. He studied stone foundations and how weight settled evenly across multiple surfaces. He watched carpenters reinforce door frames with braces, angles, and clever joinery. To observers, he was a curiosity, a silent mountain man staring for hours at warehouses and workshops. But what Samuel learned in those days would reshape frontier cabin design. When he returned to the mountains in July, he did not bring the usual supplies. Instead of whiskey, he packed 40 pounds of square-cut nails. Instead of extra tobacco, he brought 6 heavy iron brackets, 2 reinforced door hinges, and items no trapper had ever carried into the wilderness for cabin building. He wasn't just returning to trap. He was returning to build something the frontier had never seen. A cabin that a grizzly bear could not break into. And the design he created over the next several months would spread across the Rocky Mountains, quietly adopted by trappers, scouts, guides, and early settlers. It would save dozens of lives. It would become part of frontier lore. And it all started with the death of one man, and the determination of another who refused to let tragedy repeat itself. When Samuel Bridger returned to the mountains that summer, he carried supplies no trapper in the Rockies had ever hauled into the wilderness. Among them were square-cut nails that weighed 15 pounds apiece, 6 iron brackets, heavy canvas, and a specialized draw knife, a tool used for shaving and shaping wood. To most trappers, it was an odd and unnecessary burden. Nails were costly, iron hardware was heavy, and canvas seemed irrelevant to wilderness living. But Samuel was not guessing. He had a plan. He went back to the quiet creek where his partner John had been killed. But instead of rebuilding on the same spot, Samuel chose a new location, one that immediately puzzled others. Most cabins were built close to water. Hauling buckets over long distances was work no trapper wanted. Yet Samuel deliberately chose high ground about 50 yards back from the creek, on a shallow rise with clear visibility in every direction. He understood that convenience was not safety. Floodwaters couldn't reach him here. And more importantly, no animal, man or beast, could approach without being seen. Then he began building a cabin unlike anything the mountains had ever seen. Where most trappers simply stacked notched logs and hoped for the best, Samuel started with something frontier cabins rarely had: a foundation. He dug a shallow trench outlining the cabin's footprint and filled it with carefully chosen stones. This gave the cabin a level base and prevented the structure from settling unevenly, a common flaw in most frontier homes that led to cracks, shifts, and dangerous weak points. For the walls, Samuel became almost fanatical. He rejected any log that wasn't perfectly straight or uniform. While other mountain men felled whatever trees were closest, Samuel hiked miles in search of specific pines that matched his ideal size, roughly 12 inches in diameter. It took him 3 full weeks just to gather the logs. And once he had them, the real work began. Mountain men typically left bark on their logs. It saved time and added some insulation. But Samuel stripped every log bare using his draw knife. It was brutal, painstaking labor, hours of scraping per log. But Samuel knew what few others understood. Bark shifted. Bark compressed. Bark created gaps that widened over time. Smooth, uniform logs fit together tightly, almost like carved beams. But it was the corners of Samuel's cabin that revealed just how revolutionary his thinking had become. Traditional cabins used notches, saddle notches or dovetail notches, to bind logs together. These methods were quick and familiar, but they created a hidden weakness. Notched corners settled over time. Pressure from upper logs squeezed the notches, opening gaps in the walls. Worse, the notches acted like leverage points. A strong animal, or a determined intruder, could exploit the joint and shift the logs apart. Samuel refused to use notches at all. Instead, he borrowed a concept he'd seen in stone construction and adapted it for timber. He extended each log 2 feet past the corner, creating long projections. At each intersection, he drilled holes straight through the overlapping log ends and drove heavy iron pins through multiple layers at once. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But the result was astonishing. The corners became solid blocks of interlocked weight, not vulnerable joints. To break through them, a bear would have to snap thick, intact logs, something even a grizzly couldn't do without extraordinary effort. It made the cabin look strange. Every corner bristled with 2-foot log extensions. But this odd appearance hid incredible strength. No single log could be pulled loose. No notch could be pried apart. The walls worked as one unified structure. The construction was slow, painfully slow. A typical trapper could build a standard cabin in 4 days. Samuel's took 7 weeks. He shaped the contact surfaces of every log, trimming and leveling them until they rested almost perfectly against the one below. For chinking, he rejected the crude mud and moss mixture used by others. Instead, he created a blend of clay, horsehair, and pine resin he had boiled down himself. It took 3 days of preparation. Packed between the logs while still warm, the mixture dried into a flexible, waterproof seal that bonded tightly to the wood. The horsehair reinforced the clay. The resin created a glue-like grip. The result was something closer to masonry than frontier chinking. But the true masterpiece, the heart of Samuel's design, was the door. Frontier doors were typically nothing more than thin planks nailed together, hung on simple wooden pegs or leather hinges. A grizzly could tear one off in seconds. Samuel spent 2 full weeks crafting his door, beginning with thick planks he cut from the densest pine he could find. Using his draw knife, he shaped each board until the fit was so precise that light could not pass between them. He used a tongue-and groove joint, something he had studied on the massive warehouse doors of St. Louis. Each plank interlocked with the next, creating a single unified slab nearly 3 inches thick. On the interior side, he mounted the iron brackets he'd carried from the city, arranging them diagonally into a powerful X-shaped brace. Then he drove his square-cut nails through the brackets and planks, bending and clinching them on the outer surface. Once hammered and curled, these nails could not be removed. The door weighed nearly 90 pounds, massive, immovable, and built to withstand force that would shred a normal frontier door. But Samuel wasn't finished. Hinges were the weak point of any cabin. Normally, they were attached to the frame with small nails or pegs, easy targets for a bear to tear free. Samuel crafted mortises directly into the logs of the doorframe, seating the hinges into pockets carved deep into solid timber. Then he drove iron pins through the hinges and straight into the surrounding logs. To remove these hinges, one would need to destroy the logs themselves. This wasn't just a door, it was a barrier. Its locking mechanism was equally advanced. While most cabins used a simple wooden bar, Samuel engineered a heavy internal bolt system made from iron and reinforced timber. Once locked, the door could withstand enormous pressure without shifting. When the cabin was finally complete, it didn't resemble a mountain man's shelter. It looked more like a frontier fortress, heavy, reinforced, and built to endure. To most trappers it seemed excessive, even absurd. No one spent 7 weeks building a cabin. No one carried iron pins into the wilderness. No one shaped logs by hand until they fit almost seamlessly. But Samuel had seen what a bear could do. He had seen how quickly a cabin could fail. And he vowed never again to sleep in a home that couldn't protect him. Months later, when a 9-foot grizzly tested that cabin and failed to break in, Samuel's work proved itself. His strange, overbuilt shelter became legendary among mountain men. Within a decade, variations of his techniques, strengthened corners, reinforced doors, improved foundations, spread across the Rockies. Samuel Bridger's cabin was already unconventional, but the door lock he designed pushed it into a category that trappers scarcely believed possible. Most mountain men relied on a simple wooden bar dropped behind their doors, a system that slowed down raccoons more than it stopped predators. Samuel built that familiar bar, yes, but then he created an entirely different locking mechanism. A heavy beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets on the door and directly into a mortise pocket carved deep inside the adjacent wall log. When engaged, the lock didn't just secure the door, it tied the door into the wall structure itself. To force that door open, a bear or man would need to tear out part of the wall. No single shove, no body weight, no pry bar would move it. Yet Samuel added a clever twist. He cut a narrow vertical slot beside the lock, just wide enough for a hand. From the outside, the slot was concealed beneath a small hinged metal plate. Only someone who knew the exact position of the internal mechanism could reach in and operate the beam lock from outside. To anyone else, the door would appear unopenable from the exterior, as if it had no lock at all. But the window posed an entirely different challenge. Samuel needed ventilation. He needed daylight. But windows were the weakest point of any frontier cabin. Most trappers avoided them entirely. Those who didn't simply stretched rawhide over an opening, rawhide that could be shredded by a single swipe of a grizzly's paw. Samuel approached the problem with the same meticulous pragmatism that guided every other aspect of his construction. He kept the window small, just 10 by 12 inches. He placed it high on the wall, 6 feet above the floor, too high for easy access and nearly impossible for a bear to reach through. He cut the opening through the center of a single log rather than between logs, ensuring the wall remained structurally unbroken. He built a heavy wooden shutter identical in philosophy to his door, thick planks, iron brackets, and an interior locking bar. But his most ingenious addition was a frontier invention nearly a century ahead of its time. Behind the shutter, he stretched his heavy canvas tight across the opening, securing it with wooden pegs. Then he coated it with layer after layer of his clay, horsehair, pine resin compound. When the final coat cooled, it formed a half-inch thick membrane, flexible, waterproof, translucent, and far stronger than rawhide. Light filtered through gently, turning the cabin interior into a soft, warm glow. The canvas resin composite was an early form of reinforced membrane, a frontier window pane that could survive claws, weather, and years of use. A bear would need to claw at it repeatedly to break through, and even then, it offered far more protection than anything the Rockies had seen before. The chimney and fireplace were equally impressive. Most mountain men built crude mud chimneys that smoked, cracked, or collapsed in storms. Samuel gathered flat stones for a week, constructing a proper masonry fireplace, its chimney rising above the roofline in a narrow column. Inside the chimney he built a smoke shelf, a small ledge that redirected drafts and increased heat efficiency. It was an architectural detail almost never seen west of St. Louis. Every component inside the cabin was built with similar care. He raised his sleeping platform 2 feet off the ground to avoid ground chill. He constructed a small table using tight joinery and shaped wooden pegs. He built high shelves reinforced with iron brackets. Every element was overbuilt, heavy, and meant to survive decades instead of seasons. By the time Samuel placed his final supplies inside in September 1837, he had spent 3 full months constructing what trappers began calling, half-mockingly, Bridger's Fortress. They laughed at first. No one built like that. No one spent 3 months on a cabin. It ain't a home, one trapper joked. It's a jail for the mountains. But Samuel didn't care. Winter was coming and he intended to live through it. The first test arrived sooner than expected. In early October, Samuel returned from tending his traps to find enormous tracks circling the cabin. A grizzly, likely a large male, had investigated the structure. Scratches marked the logs around the door. Claw marks streaked the corners. The bear had stood on its hind legs, reaching toward the window, searching for any weakness. It found none. Over the next 2 months, it returned 3 more times. Sometimes Samuel watched from inside. He had built narrow gun ports, slits invisible from outside but wide enough to sight down a rifle barrel. Through these, he observed the bear as it pressed, pushed, clawed, and tested every part of the cabin. It sniffed the door. It pressed its weight against the corners. It pawed at the roofline. Nothing gave. The bear eventually left, frustrated, defeated, and hungry. Word traveled through the mountains. Bridger's cabin turned a grizz away, some said with amusement. Others said with awe. The trappers who laughed earlier now approached Samuel with questions. How do you pin the logs? What's that stuff in the gaps? Where'd you get the hinges? What's that window made of? Samuel didn't keep secrets. He shared everything he knew. His goal wasn't legacy, it was survival. The following spring, his methods proved their worth beyond debate. On May 6, 1838, a trapper named William Marshall experienced the nightmare every mountain man feared. A large grizzly attacked his traditional 4-day cabin, a structure nearly identical to the one Samuel had abandoned 2 years earlier. Marshall barely escaped by scrambling into a tiny loft space. He spent nearly 3 hours listening as the bear tore his cabin apart. By dawn, his food was gone, his supplies shredded, and his cabin nearly demolished. Shaken and desperate, Marshall sought out Samuel the next morning. Together they inspected the wreckage. The door lay splintered on the ground. A corner of the cabin had been pried apart. Walls were bent and sagging. The structure was beyond saving. Marshall would have died if he hadn't reached the loft in time. Samuel stayed with him for a week and helped him rebuild, this time with Bridger-style techniques. Marshall's new cabin took longer to build, yes, but when it was finished he had something far stronger, safer, and more weatherproof than the flimsy shelter he had lost. Over the next 5 years, Samuel's construction methods spread steadily through the trapping communities of the northern Rockies. Not everyone adopted them. Some still preferred to build fast and gamble with fate, but those who had ever faced a grisly attack, a hostile raid, or a destructive storm began constructing Bridger-style cabins. The advantages went beyond bare protection. These cabins stayed warmer in winter due to tight log fitting and superior insulation. They stayed drier in rain because the multi-layer roof was genuinely waterproof. They resisted sparks, rot, and collapse far better than standard cabins. While a typical trapper cabin lasted 3 to 5 years, Bridger-style cabins remained structurally sound for decades. By the early 1840s, the fur trade was dying. Beaver populations were declining, and the global market had shifted from felt hats to silk. Mountain men moved on, west to Oregon or California or back east toward civilization. But the cabins stayed. Settlers found them. Prospectors used them. Travelers sheltered in them. Many were still standing decades later. Samuel Bridger himself left the mountains in 1844. He bought a small ranch in Oregon Territory, married, started a family, and lived a quiet life far from the wilderness that had nearly killed him. But the innovations he introduced endured long after he was gone. Through the 1850s and 1860s, people continued building cabins using adaptations of Samuel's concepts. Solid foundations, carefully selected logs, reinforced corners, heavy doors, strengthened windows, and multi-layer waterproof roofs. Modern historians credit the Bridger-style approach with saving dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lives. Because often, survival went unrecorded. A cabin that didn't collapse in a storm. A door that didn't give way to a bear. A window that didn't tear open under snow or claws. The phrase, "built like a Bridger cabin," became a frontier compliment, a recognition of craftsmanship so strong that even the wilderness struggled to break it. And it all began with one man, one tragedy, and a determination that no mountain, no storm, and no grizzly would ever break through his walls again, because one man, driven by loss and obsession, refused to accept the weaknesses of frontier life. Samuel's cabin represented more than just sturdy craftsmanship. It was a complete rethinking of frontier survival. He selected each log carefully, shaping and pinning the corners so the structure acted like a single, unified block. The walls didn't shift, sag, or twist with the seasons the way ordinary frontier cabins did. Instead of mud stuffed between loose logs, Samuel used his mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin. It clung to the wood like mortar, flexing instead of cracking and sealing out wind, rain, and snow far better than anything his neighbors used. His door alone separated his construction from everyone else's. Frontier doors were usually weak planks hung on crude hinges, easy for a bear or a determined intruder to tear loose. Samuel's door wasn't just attached to the cabin, it was built into the cabin. The hinges were anchored deep into the structural logs, making the door feel like part of the wall. Behind it was a locking beam that slid horizontally into a carved pocket in the adjoining wall. Once engaged, the door couldn't be forced open without destroying an entire section of the cabin. He also added a feature other trappers had never seen, a small vertical slot covered by a hinge plate on the outside. Samuel could reach in and disengage the lock, but only if he knew exactly where to put his hand. To any outsider, the cabin appeared as if it had no exterior lock at all. The window received the same level of innovation. Windows were usually dangerous weak points, but Samuel needed light and ventilation. So he made the opening small and placed it high in the wall, cutting it through a single log to avoid structural breaks. His shutter was thick, iron-reinforced, and barred from the inside. But the real innovation was behind it, a layer of heavy canvas sealed with his clay resin mixture. The canvas became a waterproof, translucent shield that let in diffused light while resisting claws, rain, and harsh winds. It was far stronger than rawhide, the standard frontier solution. Then came the roof. Frontier roofs were famously unreliable, leaky, drafty, and easily damaged. Samuel designed one that could withstand nearly anything the wilderness threw at it. He laid thick ridge poles spaced closer than usual, then added tightly fitted planks, birch bark layers, and finally a thick sod covering. The birch bark repelled water, while the clay resin layer sealed the seams. The living sod on top added insulation and weight, anchoring everything in place. The finished roof was not only waterproof but also fire-resistant, temperature-stable, and strong enough to hold the weight of a full-grown grizzly. Inside, Samuel added a proper stone fireplace, rare among mountain men. Its narrow chimney discouraged animals, and a smoke shelf reduced backdrafts and reflected heat into the cabin. He built a raised sleeping platform to escape ground chill, constructed shelves reinforced with iron brackets, and arranged every element with careful intention. Other trappers mocked him, calling the place Bridger's Fortress. But their jokes ended the first time a grizzly put Samuel's work to the test. Over several visits through the fall and winter, the bear examined every corner, scratched at the walls, pushed on the door, and tried to reach the window. Each time the structure held perfectly. Samuel even watched one attack from a hidden gun port, a narrow slit invisible from outside. The bear eventually gave up and walked away. The real lesson came months later when another trapper, William Marshall, suffered a devastating bear attack. His quickly built cabin collapsed in minutes, leaving his supplies ruined and his life narrowly saved only because he hid in a cramped loft. Samuel helped him rebuild, this time using the reinforced techniques he had developed. It took longer, but the result was a cabin that could actually protect its owner. Over the next few years, Bridger-style cabins spread across the Rockies. Not everyone adopted them, but those who faced real danger, bears, raids, or brutal winters, quickly saw their value. These cabins lasted decades instead of years, kept out rain and snow, held steady temperatures, and most importantly kept their occupants alive. The physics behind Samuel's construction were surprisingly advanced for frontier times. Pinned corners distributed force evenly, preventing structural failure. Integrated hinges turned a weak door into a fortified barrier. Iron hardware resisted rot, strain, and weathering. And the chinking mixture flexed instead of cracking, preserving its seal through freezing winters and hot summers. Samuel's genius wasn't strength, it was prevention. Where others relied on guns and grit, he built infrastructure that eliminated the danger before it reached him. He never needed to fire a shot at a bear because no bear could break into his cabin. His innovations echoed far beyond the mountains. Settlers who found abandoned Bridger-style cabins adopted their techniques. The army, trading posts, and early homesteaders used similar construction elements. By the mid-1800s, Samuel's once-mocked methods had quietly shaped how the American frontier built its most durable shelters. Samuel Bridger died in 1871 in Oregon, far from the wilderness that had defined his youth. His gravestone mentioned nothing of his mountain years or his cabins. But the structures he built, and the lives they saved, became his true legacy. Even decades later, travelers found Bridger-style cabins still standing, still solid, still guarding their inhabitants from a harsh world. Samuel had proven a simple truth. On the frontier, survival wasn't just about bravery, it was about building smarter than the wilderness could break. Thanks for watching this journey into one of the frontier's greatest forgotten innovations. Samuel Bridger never claimed to be a hero, but his determination to survive reshaped how cabins were built across the Rocky Mountains. His work reminds us that history isn't only changed by legends with rifles, it's also shaped by quiet problem solvers who build better, think deeper, and share what they learn. If you enjoyed this story of engineering, survival, and frontier ingenuity, subscribe for more lost histories and untold stories from the American past. Until next time, stay curious and stay prepared.